Well, agencies throughout Ouachita Parish make nearly 100 arrests for drug activity. Good evening to you. I'm Jennifer Andrews. Kenya Ross is here now with more on the raid. Kenya?
Yes, Jennifer, 9 agencies in Ouachita Parish teamed up to make exactly 99 arrests, seizing firearms and substantial amounts of drugs.
We're hyper-focused on getting violent criminal offenders off the streets in Monroe and Ouachita Parish. I think the results of this investigation over the time period is phenomenal. We're still going after the toughest of the tough and the worst of the worst.
9 agencies across Ouachita Parish teamed up to conduct a warrant roundup on July 15th and July 16th, resulting in 99 arrests, seizing 29 firearms, including 3 that were stolen. Plus, they seized drugs such as cocaine, THC products, prescription drugs, and marijuana. 4th Judicial District Attorney Steve Tu mentioned an amended bill which created the Truth and Transparency in the State Criminal Justice System program.
Briefly, what it does is it takes away good time for sex offenders and violent habitual offenders, and it reduces the good time that an offender can get to 15%. Before this law was passed, it was impossible for me or anybody else to calculate what a 10-year sentence really meant. How long is that offender going to stay in jail because of all the back-end releases and the law?
On a display board, the agencies had photos of mugshots, but they were covered up with a label reading "photo unavailable." The photos aren't public records because of a law that was passed in 2022.
That law prohibits law enforcement from disseminating the booking photos of an inmate who's been arrested. In the last legislative session, they passed a law that amended that law and really revoked it, and now these booking photos are public records.
And those mugshots will be public record beginning August 1st.